Hey, Liz.
Hi, Liz.
Sounds good, Dave. Thank you.
All right, you're up. We're on the air.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the June 1st, 2021 meeting of the Town of Kennebunkport's Growth Planning Committee. I'd like to start off by introducing our members. I'm Dan Saunders, I'm the chair. We have Jim Fitzgerald on, he is our vice chair. We have Janet Powell, who is our
Sounds
secretary.
good, Dave.
Thank you. Paul Hogan, Jim McMahon, who are two of our members, and then also Mike Corsi, who is an alternate, but participates heavily in our meetings. And I will make a mention that we have a second alternate position that is open. And as an alternate, you participate in the meetings. The only thing you can't do is vote on any motions we make unless a voting member is absent and then an alternate is added. So if you're interested in joining our committee, I'd ask you to put an application into the town. Also on our committee is Werner Gilliam. He's Director of Planning and Development for the town and our liaison with the town and our leader in guiding us and keeping us on track. Joining us are two consultants that we've been working with, and I'm hopeful that all of you on board are familiar with the work they've been doing for our town starting in September 2019. We have Liz Durfee of EF Design and Planning, and also Tom Morgan of TZM Planning. And then for tonight, we do have a guest speaker, Dr. Jane KNOTT, but I'll let Tom introduce her after I make a couple of, kind of review what our agenda is this evening and talk a little bit about our comp plan. As you know, our comp plan was approved in 2012 by the state and by you, the voters. And it's good for about 10 years. So we embarked on the redo of this plan back in 2019, and that's when Tom and Liz joined us. Previously, as you probably remember, in the 2012 one was one where we submitted chapter at every town meeting or every town vote for you to review it chapter by chapter. And that was very beneficial at the time, but this time we want to step back and make sure that we actually submit this as one single plan, because there are opportunities to ensure that we have a lot of good consistency and we're dealing with a number of subjects through each of those chapters and a cohesion of the plan. And that's why we got Liz and Tom on board to help us get that done. For the agenda this evening, after this brief introduction and Tom's introduction, Jane will give her presentation. And then we will take a short break when she's completed, and we'll allow you an opportunity to use our Q&A to submit questions that we will then read and ask Dr. KNOTT to answer for us. That will then be followed by a discussion on the comp plan with Jane and the GPC. And then we'll have some discussions about some future workshops that we plan to hold this summer. And hopefully they will all be in person as we have moved through this as we move towards the end of this COVID process. So I hope that kind of gives you a quick overview. And I guess with no further ado, I'll introduce Tom and ask him to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Pretty much everybody along coastal Maine's familiar with the talk of sea level rising. But what's less well known is the impact that sea level rise will have on groundwater on the immediate coast and as far as 2 or 3 miles inland. You know, what's going to impact, as we're going to hear tonight, roadways, septic systems, and wells. So our speaker tonight is an expert in that field. It's Dr. Jane KNOTT. She's a research associate at UMass Boston, and she does consulting as the head of JFK Environmental Services. Jane earned her bachelor's degree in geology and physics at Mount Holyoke College, a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering at MIT, and a PhD in civil environmental engineering at the University of New Hampshire. She has more than 20 years of experience, primarily with the United States Geological Survey, and she's done consulting throughout New England. Her research interests, as you'll hear shortly, include the climate change adaptation planning for coastal road infrastructure and temperature and sea level rise induced groundwater rise and their impacts on pavement. Jane has also served as a review editor for the National Climate Assessment back in 2017, 2018. And that's kind of a indicator that she's nationally recognized as a climate scientist. I was reading the Washington Post one day last August. This is my custom first thing in the morning, and I was reading about an article, and I see James starting to smile here. They were quoting a national expert on roadway pavement and the impact of climate change, and they said, faced with uncertainty, civil engineers can do little but guess, and the wrong guess could be costly. Consider, for example, design that will withstand all of the environmental conditions you might expect over the lifetime of a road. This is a quote from the expert. The problem with that is when you build a road that's good for all conditions, you end up with a very thick asphalt. When you consider paving an entire roadway, that extra asphalt costs a lot of money. Plus, you're raising the road so many trucks won't fit under the bridge. It's very complex. And then I said, wait a minute, just talk to KNOTT. The name's familiar. What's this name familiar? And of course, wait a minute, it's Jane, So I was impressed that she was the Washington Post sought out somebody who knew her stuff on roadway pavement and climate change, and they landed with our speaker this evening. Liz and I and the Growth Planning Committee are very pleased to bring Jane to Maine. Jane, welcome to Kennebunkport, and tell us what you've been learning.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really a nice introduction. I appreciate that. I'm thrilled to be, I would like to be in Kennebunkport actually right now. My husband and I were thinking that this would be really a fun trip to make in order to do this presentation, but unfortunately we're all still stuck behind our computers, which has its benefit as well. But when you have a beautiful place like Kennebunkport, you just want to be there in person and meet the folks. Anyway, would you like me to share my screen at this point?
Sure.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. So everybody can see the full screen?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, great. This, I think I'm on the agenda for a half an hour. This is probably going to be longer than that. So I will be going through some of these slides quite quickly, but please feel free to jot down any questions you might have, and we can go over them in more detail. But basically, I just want to give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing with respect to climate change and groundwater, and specifically try to tie it a little bit to Kennebunkport. We haven't done any modeling up in Kennebunkport, but we can make some comparisons. So the outline of this presentation, I'll start with a very general brief background, and then go into Groundwater-Rise with sea level rise, with the implications for coastal road infrastructure like Tom had mentioned, and water quality degradation, wetland expansion, and then talk a little bit about some groundwater modeling that we did in Durham, New Hampshire, to give you an idea of how you can use groundwater models to help in your planning. And then talk about climate change and aquifer recharge and how that affects water supply. And then finish up with some conclusions. So you've all seen this is the hydrologic cycle. You saw it maybe quite a long time ago in school. But basically I'm just showing this screen to give you an idea of the complexity of the hydrologic cycle. Rainfall from the sky, groundwater underneath, you have surface water in the form of lakes and streams. And typically what happens is everything makes its way to the ocean. A lot of it seeps into the ground and makes its way to the ocean through groundwater, and some of it runs off, directly running off the land or running off into streams, which then discharge to the sea. With climate change, as temperature increases, you have precipitation increases and you have evaporation increases due to the rising temperature, but you also have sea level rising as a result of the expansion of water and then also the melting of glaciers. So how might climate change affect groundwater? One way is the changes in precipitation. If precipitation increases, you might get rising groundwater levels. But if precipitation comes in huge amounts in a short period of time, you might not have as much recharge of your groundwater system. It might all just run off. Temperature, as I mentioned, it can increase evaporation, and it can also increase evapotranspiration, so that's water loss out of the ground. And also, as temperatures rise, people use more water. They use it to water their grass, they use it for drinking, and other things. And it can affect, sea levels can rise with climate change, and then sea level rise can cause groundwater to rise in coastal areas. I can't really see what that's saying, but essentially those two things, precipitation and temperature, that causes changes in aquifer recharge, and then the sea level rising causes groundwater to rise. So now we'll focus mainly in this talk on groundwater rise caused by the sea level rise. And this figure is just basically something that you've probably seen before. As Tom had mentioned earlier, when you think of climate change and sea level rise, you think of the surface water effects, you think of storm surge, you think of higher high tides, you think of flooding from the ocean, and so on. But I like to think about what's happening underground. And what's happening underground is you can't see it, but it's definitely there. So this is a more complete picture. It shows the rising sea levels. But underneath the ocean, you have groundwater, which is in the sand and gravel beneath the seafloor, and that's typically salty. And then underneath the land surface, you have fresh groundwater, and the fresh groundwater kind of floats on top of the salty groundwater. And as sea level rises, the groundwater, because of the changes in hydraulic head, the groundwater also rises. So essentially what happens is you get more aquifer recharge until a new equilibrium is found, and the groundwater levels near the coast are higher than they were before. And this happens over a long period of time. It's a long process. Groundwater moves through the ground much slower than surface water does, but it's insidious. So one question I would raise to people is, can a seawall really keep the water out? So a seawall obviously, stops the surface water from coming in, but you still have that change in head, the difference in hydraulic pressure, and that forces groundwater underneath the seawall, and it can come up in the form of surface flooding from the ground, essentially. So now I'll move on to some of the case studies that we've done in New Hampshire, but I'm going to be jumping back and forth to Kennebunkport to try and keep it relevant. So in coastal New Hampshire, we did some groundwater modeling. And when you do groundwater modeling, you take into effect a lot of things. It's not just the groundwater. You look at the land surface elevation, and we use LIDAR for that. You look at the geology, the Surficial geology, and the bedrock geology. You also have to take into account the streams, lakes, and wetlands, which are boundary conditions for the groundwater. And you need to know how much water is seeping into the ground. That's called aquifer recharge, the amount of water that seeps into the ground and actually gets down to the groundwater table. And you also have to look at the public water supplies, because that's really a sink. That's wells, public water supply wells are pulling the groundwater out of the ground. Domestic wells do the same thing, but not at as high a rate. So we'll jump right now to the results. So this is a map of coastal New Hampshire. You can see Great Bay and the Gulf of Maine and Portsmouth to the north. And And essentially I'm showing with the little squiggly lines are the streams. The colors are showing where the groundwater will rise with sea level rise. And this scenario is 6.6 feet of sea level rise, so this is quite a lot of sea level rise. But it shows you the groundwater rise signal goes quite a ways inland. As a matter of fact, we saw from our modeling that the groundwater rises actually 4 to 5 kilometers inland, whereas the tidal surface water flooding that you usually see mapped in communities is only 1.5 kilometers. So, but let me be clear, I'm not saying that this is where groundwater is flooding the ground surface. This is just where you're seeing groundwater rise, which means groundwater levels higher than what they were at today's sea levels, so to speak. Some of the other things that we observed in this modeling is that the groundwater rise actually is not as high near streams. And the reason for that is that the groundwater actually does rise, but it discharges more quickly to the stream, so you get increased stream flow. And then this groundwater rise is affected by geology, it's affected by the coastal geometry, it's affected by pumping. And there are areas, low land surface areas, where groundwater will actually inundate the land surface and cause flooding. We call that groundwater inundation, or GWI. So who cares, right? Is this really a problem? We really don't see the groundwater. How can this affect us? Why do we care about it as planners? Well, in areas where the groundwater is already shallow or not very deep, when groundwater rises, it can get into the underlying layers of pavements and weaken the pavements. Because basically when we build roads, we measure the groundwater level that it is today, and we say, okay, we want it to be the road to be a certain height above the groundwater table. So we build our roads that way. But we don't take into account the fact that groundwater might rise. We always think that, yeah, groundwater goes up and down with seasons, but on average, it's going to stay pretty much the same. So what we're talking about is a systematic groundwater rise caused by the sea level rise that's occurring with climate change. Another thing that can happen with groundwater rise is shown up here. You see a house with a septic system. The water table is quite deep, but if the water table comes up, then it intersects the septic system and you get groundwater contamination. And when you get groundwater contamination, you can also get surface water contamination because the groundwater will discharge the surface water. I mentioned that with rising groundwater, you can also get increases in stream flow. And then down here, it's showing the saltwater, freshwater interface underground that can move inland. So if you have wells that are tapping the fresh groundwater close to the coast, you might find that those wells could become salty. Another thing underneath the roads is underground infrastructure, sewer pipes, water pipes. When they're old, a lot of times they're cracked. And as groundwater rises, groundwater can get into the sewer system, which is a problem. If it's salty, it's a real problem. If it's not, it's just it's a quantity problem that you're treating too much water. You can also get wetland expansion, transition, or drowning, and you can get moisture damage in historic buildings. So let's focus a little bit on the premature pavement failure. This is a cross-section of a road. So you have the asphalt on the top, the base layer is usually crushed stone or gravel, and the subbase could be sand, and the subgrade is the natural soils. As groundwater rises, it moves up into these underlying layers, and these underlying layers are really are what hold the weight of the truck traffic, essentially. So when you get groundwater in there, it weakens those layers, and you get rising temperatures with climate change, and that weakens the asphalt layer. So you're getting weakening from both ends. You're getting weakening from down under, and you're getting weakening from the top, and that results in fatigue cracking of your pavements, and it results in rutting. So we took a look. This is at Portsmouth Circle in New Hampshire. We took a look at a cross section here, and the blue line. Let's see. I have this purple pointer. Hopefully, you can see it pretty well. This blue line here is the current groundwater table, and this is what the groundwater table would be with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. And over here in this corner that's circled in black, it really doesn't matter because the groundwater is deep already. And so when you get like a 4-foot increase in groundwater level, or it really doesn't matter. But where it does matter is where the land surface is low and the groundwater is near the surface already, then you add 2 feet, 3 feet, or whatever, and you're weakening your pavement in that section, or you might even be getting flooding. So we took a look, we took the groundwater modeling results, and this area here is the area that I showed you that was colored. We call that the Groundwater-Rise zone. This is the area where groundwater will rise with sea level rise. And then we identified sections of roads in this area where the groundwater was already close to the surface, and that's basically what we highlighted in red, and we said these are your vulnerable roads. These are the roads that might be damaged as groundwater rises with sea level rise. So now I'll just show you a couple of cross sections at Gosling Road and Route 286. So Route 286 is the figure on the top here. This is the cross section. You have asphalt on the top, and you have your gravel base, and then you have your subgrade. There's really only 2 layers here at Route 286. It's not a very big road, doesn't carry a lot of traffic. It doesn't carry a lot of truck traffic. And so with that structure, when groundwater rises, here's the current groundwater level, and when it rises up into the base layers, it really weakens the pavement. This figure is just showing the pavement life with 1 foot of sea level rise and 2.7 feet of sea level rise, and you can see that as groundwater rises with the sea level rise, the strength of the pavement drops off. And that's pretty severe for this piece of roadway. For Gosling Road, the structure is different. You have asphalt, you have a thick layer of base, underneath that you have another layer of gravel, and then you have a subbase, which is sand, and that added structure makes the pavement more resilient. But still, you do get a decrease in pavement life at this location as well. But the point from this is that as long as you know where your roads might be suffering this weakening, you can plan for it. You can plan for it in the structure of the road. Water quality degradation was another thing that I mentioned. So wastewater treatment in Kennebunkport, and I got this out of Tom and Liz's report, and some other sources too as well. But you have a sewer collection system that serves about 3,500 customers, or slightly half of the inhabited buildings. And the sewer system is mostly in the densely populated areas. But sewer mains in some areas are pretty old and may be cracked in places, and so infiltration of groundwater might be a concern already. If you're getting rising groundwater and these sewer mains aren't repaired, you'll get more groundwater in your sewer system. So the other way that we handle wastewater treatment is on-site wastewater treatment systems, or septic systems, as we know here in the Northeast. And I believe the remainder of the town that's not served by sewer is serviced by septic systems. Like I live in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and I'm familiar with with a rocky coastline, much like you are up in Maine, and typically you have a high water table in bedrock and really not a lot of sand and gravel on top of that. And it's the sand and gravel that makes septic systems work well because it gives you an area where you can filter the contaminants out. Aging and poorly maintained septic systems pose a problem to the health of surface waters, such as the Kennebunk River and the other rivers in the area. So this is a map just showing your sewer system in Kennebunkport, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. And so what I'm saying is that the rest of this area here is served by septic systems. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on Kennebunkport the way you folks are. So septic systems, you have a septic tank and you have a soil treatment area, leach field. But the treatment also occurs in the soil beneath the leach field as it moves down toward the groundwater table. And the limiting condition on the way these septic systems perform is really where is the saturated soil? Because once you hit the saturated soil, then the contaminants can move more readily with the groundwater. So this is just a schematic drawing showing how the contaminated water moves through the soils. And when you have an elevated water table, the treatment zone between the leaching field and the water table gets smaller. So the treatment time and the treatment distance is reduced. Most septic systems are designed that they have to be they're required to be in places where the groundwater table is at least 4 to 5 feet below the leaching field trench base. And so when the groundwater is deeper than 5 feet, then they're at low risk of failure. High risk of failure is where you have the groundwater that's above the 5 feet below the base of the septic system, and you have failed septic systems when the groundwater table is above that trench or really flooding your septic system. So when you think about the future, this is all well and good that our septic systems have been designed properly, and but when groundwater rises, then septic systems that might have been okay might not be okay in the future. And you want to know which ones those are. So that's why we do this kind of research. Same thing applies to hazardous waste disposal areas. This could be, it could be the town dump. It could be, other landfills. It could be spills in Massachusetts. And I'm sure in Maine that when there's a spill of a hazardous waste substance, they typically say, well, where's the groundwater? If the groundwater's deep, it's not as much of an issue. If the groundwater is shallow, then the contaminants can get into the groundwater and cause more problems. Now we move on to wetland expansion, transition, and drowning, and I think you've probably already heard about wetlands migration, salt marsh migration with sea level rise. This is wetlands in Kennebunkport. The colors that you're seeing here, I think you may have already seen in the work that Tom and Liz are doing, basically pointing out which wetlands are serving the various functions on the right-hand side of the slide. The wetlands that are red are very important wetlands. They're serving all 6 functions. Orange are serving 5 functions for the community, and so on and so forth. So our wetlands, as you know, are really important for a number of different reasons. And the salt marshes are providing a lot of different functions for fish and for flood control and all that. But the freshwater wetlands are serving very important functions as well. And what happens with groundwater rise is that the freshwater wetlands that are further inland can also expand, or they can get deeper. And so that the wetland plants can change, they can transition, and there can be, changes to the entire ecosystem. What does this mean for planners? Well, typically with the Wetlands Protection Act, we have a buffer zone away from wetlands. If these freshwater wetlands or saltwater wetlands are expanding, then our buffer zones might not be protective enough. We go back and we take a look at the salt marshes here in red and orange, and the area that's circled in black is like a barrier beach here in Kennebunkport. And so when you look at barrier beaches, this is actually a schematic drawing from a study that was done in the Carolinas. You can see what happens when groundwater rises with sea level rise. The figure on the top shows fresh groundwater, nice thick layer really of fresh groundwater, and the salty groundwater is underneath. But with sea level rise, you get the salty groundwater rising, squeezing out the fresh groundwater. Some of the wetlands change. Some of them die, some of them, drown, essentially. And you get, here's like salt grass, and that's all been flooded. So you get changes in the ecosystems. So here's the coast, and here's the sandy beach, which is quite high, and that's protected or can be protected, but it's really these areas in the back, these wetland areas in the back that are affected by the rising groundwater. This is Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we took a look at how much the wetlands would expand there. And we found that the freshwater wetland in Portsmouth would increase by 3% by the year 2030, and 10% by mid-century, and 19 to 25% by the end of the century. So that's just an expanding of these freshwater wetlands. Now I'm going to show you some groundwater modeling results that we just came up with. It's really hot off the press, actually. We haven't published the report yet, but we finished the modeling, and so I'm going to also compare this to Kennebunkport. So this is the town of Durham. It's a lot like Kennebunkport. It has rivers, and it has an estuary, and so on. Durham on the left, I'm showing you the river network. Durham on the right, I'm showing you the surficial geology. There's a lot of till. The light tan is glacial marine sediments, sands and gravels, and maybe some silts and clays. So now we'll jump to Kennebunkport, very similar. We have streams, stream network, and we have the Kennebunk River. And we have wetlands, and on the right we have our surficial geology of till, which is right on top of bedrock, and that usually groundwater doesn't flow very well through till. But then we have these areas here, which is sand and gravel. Sand and gravel is the hatched area, and then the dotted area is sand. Groundwater flows nicely through these areas. And also you have the alluvial sediments along the river, and you have salt marsh sediments, and of course inland wetlands as well. And so back to Durham. So these are the modeling results. So basically this area here shown in black with the hatched mark is the groundwater rise zone that we determined from our modeling. And that's with 8 feet of sea level rise. So that's with a lot of sea level rise. The green here that I'm showing is what the groundwater rise would look like with 1 foot of sea level rise. And then the next one, it's with 2 feet of sea level rise, and you can see the groundwater rise here shown. So now we have a little bit of light green close to the coast, and it's all moving inland a little further. This is with 4 feet of sea level rise. You get more groundwater rise and you get higher levels of groundwater rise. Right near the streams, you don't get much groundwater rise at all, like I had mentioned earlier, because you get more discharge to the streams. So the actual stream flow increases as a result of all of this. 6 feet, it's a little more different. It's a little more, the magnitude is a little higher, the extent is a little greater, and 8 feet brings us out to the groundwater rise zone that I showed you in the beginning. So when you see this, it looks pretty scary. You think, oh wow, all of this area is affected by rising groundwater. But again, like I mentioned before with the roads, it's really only a problem in areas where groundwater is already shallow. So that's the next thing we do is we look at, well, where's the groundwater shallow? So this is showing where the groundwater depth is less than 10 feet. And this is with 8 feet of sea level rise. These are areas where the groundwater depth is less than 15 feet. So when you take that information and you take the information from the model of where groundwater rises, you see that there are areas that really aren't affected by groundwater rise. These areas in here, we cut out because the groundwater was too deep in that area. But the greens, these are the areas where we get groundwater rise, where the groundwater is fairly shallow. So then these circles here are showing parts of the road right here, over here, perhaps through here, over here, and right in this area where the groundwater is shallow and you expect groundwater rise. So those would be areas where you would want your DPW to focus on perhaps different maintenance procedures or timing to try and avoid the high cost of premature road failure, pavement failure. Septic systems, we looked at septic systems in Durham. These are just the septic systems that are within 1 kilometer of the shoreline. We plotted them all, and we plotted them on this map showing the groundwater rise. But again, it's not all of these septic systems are projected to fail, only the ones where the groundwater is already shallow. And so those are the ones that might be problematic in the future. So again, this is telling a story of problems that communities might have, but it also is narrowing it down and giving you the information that you need. Where are my problem areas really going to be? These are plots that we did about surface water. Oyster River in Durham is a tidal estuary, like your estuary. And so what we found is that when sea level rises from 0 to 8, you see that the flux from between the surface water and the groundwater discharge to Oyster River drops off. It decreases. And so you're getting more salt water coming in and less fresh water going out. The freshwater streams, I don't know if you can see this because of the pictures of us, but the freshwater streams, what we're seeing is approximately 12% increase in groundwater discharge to the freshwater streams. So back to Kennebunkport. We haven't done any groundwater modeling in Kennebunkport, but we can take a look at ground surface elevation. So I took a quick look this was USGS digital elevation models to see where the low areas are. The green is showing the land surface is low, and the red and the orange is showing where the land surface is high. And this is zoomed in to this area, to Goose Rocks Beach. And basically you're seeing that the ground surface elevation here at the front of the beach is high, but it is not high, but it's higher than it is in the back here. When I say back, I mean on the other side of the dunes. So here we have a wetland, we have the brook and the creek here, and the ground surface elevation is low. And we have roads and we have houses, and these are the areas that will be affected when you think about, okay, yeah, we're getting sea level rise, but we're also getting groundwater rise. Those are areas that might be affected. We zoom in even closer, and we can see that over in this area over here, it's really the groundwater is very shallow, probably very shallow there, and those roads and homes will be affected. We go over to downtown, the downtown area, and we take a look at the ground surface elevation. This is all high. This is not going to be affected by rising groundwater. The groundwater will rise here, but it's probably not that close to the surface. But it's these lower areas here that might be affected more. And historical buildings and archaeological sites, when you're getting groundwater that's already close to the surface rising, that might impact these archaeological sites, or the historic buildings might get more moisture in the basement, water in the basement, more water in the basement, and cause structural damage. So those are things to think about. So now climate change, aquifer recharge, and water supply. Liz and Tom, if I'm going on too long, please let me know, and I can speed it up, or we can stop it early.
You're doing, yeah.
I'm sorry?
You're doing fine.
Okay. So when we get to drinking water sources, the Kennebunkport sources are private wells, public wells, and then surface and groundwater supplied by the KKWWD, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The groundwater sources produce about close to 40% of the water produced in 2019. So, being a novice to Kennebunkport, I wanted to know where these sources were. So I took a look and on the website, and it comes from the Branch Brook watershed, and there's a sand and gravel aquifer there, which sustains Branch Brook, which is great, really nice aquifer. And the water district, they get their surface water. Now this is for the whole area, not just Kennebunkport, but 64% of their water comes from surface water, and 35% comes from groundwater, and then they get some water from other utility interconnections. So I wanted to look at this system, and you can see that the service area in Kennebunkport is shaded in yellow, and this is the larger area of Kennebunk and Kennebunkport and wells that are served by this water district. But this is more interesting to me, and that is, where are these aquifers? And the aquifers are here. You have a small aquifer here up on the border between Kennebunkport and Biddeford, and a little one here. But this is a very large aquifer, sand and gravel aquifer, and I presume that they're getting a fair amount of their groundwater from these aquifer areas, but also the aquifer areas do serve the surface water as well that's used for water supply. So while we focus on Kennebunkport for this master plan, or this comprehensive plan, you also want to consider where your water sources are coming from and how they might be affected by groundwater rise and climate change. So saltwater intrusion can be a problem. In our areas in the Northeast, it's usually not that much of a problem because, well, it is on Cape Cod, because it's a lot of sand and gravel, and here we have a lot of bedrock. It can be a problem in bedrock aquifers, but it really is hard to tell where that problem's going to be because of the fractures. Where are the fractures? But anyway, we did a study of this in Durham, and so this is the Durham map again. This is Oyster River, and this is part of Great Bay. And the red here is showing the salt water offshore. It's showing salt water in the top layer of the model. And then this kind of lighter pink is showing where the salt water has intruded into underneath the ground, very deep down, about 1,000 feet down. And you can see here that the shallow groundwater doesn't move the shallow salt water doesn't move as far inland as the deep salt water. So when you have saltwater intrusion, your deep wells are going to see salt water before your shallow wells will. So this is the current condition, and this is with sea level rise. This next figure is sea level rise, and you really don't see much difference. So sea level rise in this case in Durham is not having a big effect. The thing that really you can see a little change up here. Whoops. Sorry. You can see a little change here. Up here is where I'm talking about. Whoops. Sorry, I guess you get the point. But anyway, the thing that affects saltwater intrusion more than sea level rise really is how close your wells are to the coast and how much you're pumping. So it's really a well location issue in Durham. And in Durham, the wells are quite a ways away. So now I'm going to change a little bit and go to aquifer recharge. So we're going to take a step away from groundwater rise, from sea level rise, and say, gee, we're having a drought right now, temperatures are increasing, how's that going to affect groundwater? So on the left, this is a study that I did with UMass. We took a look at recharge and how that would be affected in the future with changing climate, changing precipitation, and changing temperature. And what we found was that the recharge rate, or the rate of water moving into the aquifer, is increasing in the near term, but it's decreasing pretty significantly in the future. So basically what we're saying is that even though precipitation, the large precipitation events are getting stronger, the temperature rise and the increase in evapotranspiration is causing more water loss and will continue to cause more water loss in the future. Recharge is always a very seasonal thing. In the summer, you don't get much recharge because the plants are taking all of it, essentially. So what we're seeing here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, is with time going from 2011 to the end of the century, we're going to see a decrease in aquifer recharge in the early months, January, February, and March, and an increase in the fall, September, October, November, December. And that's pretty consistent for all of these locations: Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Hampton, New Hampshire, Drake, Mass, and Pepperell, Mass. So you're seeing a change in the seasonal pattern. So conclusions: the groundwater rise zone extends about 2 miles in from the coast in Durham. It really depends. You can't say that's the case everywhere because it does depend on the geology and the geometry and pumping and things like that. The impacts will occur where the groundwater is already close to the surface. And these impacts could be premature pavement failure in some roads, some sections of roads. infrastructure damage, stormwater, underground utilities, or sewage treatment plants can be affected. Water quality degradation from drinking water, surface water bodies, and ecosystems. The wetlands can expand. Groundwater discharge to freshwater rivers can increase or will increase, and the discharge to tidal estuaries will decrease. And that really has implications for chemistry. Saltwater intrusion, that's an issue that's very site specific, but it's important to look at, especially if you have wells close to the coast. And then aquifer recharge is projected to decrease, and this has implications for water supply. So when you do groundwater modeling, what can you do with it? Obviously, you can identify the roads that are vulnerable, and then you can develop an adaptation plan. You can identify stormwater and other infrastructure that might be compromised, and then target those areas for leaks and backflow preventers, perhaps. For wetland expansion, if you know which wetlands might expand, you can talk about changing the buffer zone regulations or the wetlands policies. You can try to realize that if wetlands are going to expand, then those are not good areas to build close to the buffer. You can identify areas of potential septic system failures and investigate potential impacts on coastal ecosystems and aquaculture. You can also usually when we do a groundwater model, we'd like to not just do one community, we like to do a regional area because the boundary of a particular community isn't where all hydrology stops. Some people share water supplies, like in this case, and the hydrology is really a regional thing that's determined by rivers and geology. Additional modeling work can always look at contaminant transport. If you find an area where contamination is a problem, you can actually model the contaminant transport. You can simulate the installation of new public water supply wells and see if saltwater intrusion might be an issue. You can also investigate changing pumping rates. And you can determine and analyze the effects of changing recharge rates that I touched on just really briefly. And also look at the groundwater and surface water interactions. So that's it for me. I'd like to, this work was done with a lot of help from different groups, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Town of Durham, Stratford Regional Planning Commission, New Hampshire CAW, the Conservation Law Foundation, and University of New Hampshire and University of Massachusetts. So thank you for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So at this point, we'll take maybe a brief break and see if we get a couple of questions from guests who've been watching. If not, I know I have a couple. So
Right.
let's take a couple minute break here and get a drink.
How do we ask questions?
There's a good point. There's a open your Q&A should be at the bottom of your screen, or maybe top of your screen, depending on what kind of tool you're using. It was the bottom of my PC. It was the top of my iPad. You click on that, and you can just type in a question. Oh, good. We got one. So please feel free to continue to type them in, and what I'll do is I'll read those for Dr. KNOTT to consider or other members of the GPC. So how do I determine the closeness of groundwater to the surface on my property?
Are we waiting for all the questions to come in?
Well, we can. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we can start with that if you're ready.
Okay. Okay, sure. Well, in a community, at least in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts, and I'm pretty sure this is the case in Maine as well. Whenever someone drills a well, you have to file a report with the state, and so the states are getting much better at making these well logs available, and making them accessible essentially by just going online. So basically, and if you're not able to do that, there are people who can help you with that. You can look in your neighborhood for wells and get an idea of how deep the water table is there. The other thing you can do is you can, if you're close to a stream or if you're close to the ocean or you're close to a wetland, those are typically surface reflections of the groundwater. And you can have an idea that your groundwater's not that deep if you're right close. But the best way is really to drill a well and so you hit water, but nobody really does that unless they need to.
Right. So potentially a neighbor that may have a well, if
Yes.
you don't, right? I know when I bought my property, I was given the information of how deep my well was.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and it's really not how deep your well is, but it's where the water level is
Sure,
as well.
sure. Yep. That I don't know. I just know how deep they went, but I don't know how deep the water is.
Yep.
The other part of his question was, how do I determine the projected closeness value of concern versus time? That'd probably be from modeling, right?
How do I determine the closeness of ground? Okay, how do I determine the projected closeness value of concern versus time? Meaning, how soon are you expecting the groundwater to rise?
Yeah, that's the way I'm reading that.
Yeah. That's a really good question. That's what we determine with the modeling, and it really depends on where you're located. It depends on what the geology is like. Mm-hmm. But it's when you're looking at groundwater rise relative to sea level rise, the groundwater is never going to rise any higher than the sea level rise is. So that's a limiting factor. If you have sea level rise of 2 feet, your groundwater, if you're right close to the coast, might rise close to 2 feet. But as you move further inland, it'll be less. And the amount of time it takes for that to happen, you really can't say without modeling it.
Thank you.
I can add a little bit on that question there, the closeness of groundwater to the surface. Just another resource to look at. If your property's serviced by a septic system, oftentimes in the design for the septic system, there'll be what's called depth delimiting factors that are shown on the design. And so that'll give you a pretty good indication of the depth to whatever the limiting factor is, whether that's groundwater, in a lot of cases it's groundwater, in a lot of cases, in Kennebunkport, it's bedrock, would be the limiting factor, but that's another place where you can look, for that information.
And where do they normally list what the limiting factor is? Will they say
Yes.
groundwater? They will?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and sometimes it's not, it's not necessarily apparent whenever test pits are dug. Sometimes it's obvious that groundwater is the issue because they dig a hole and there's the groundwater. Yeah. But in some cases, it's also determined based on the soils that you're looking at. Whether or not there's the different colorations in the soils will often indicate whether or not that's where the water table is.
Okay. So we have another question. It says, how can the layperson discern if a private residential septic system is failing or leaching contaminants into the groundwater?
Is that a question for me or?
Yourself or Werner, if you have a...
Yeah, Jane, if you want to jump in on that, go for it.
Well, again, if it's related to the groundwater level, so if you determine that the groundwater is quite high on your property, and you know you have a septic system, you have your records of your septic system, or it's at the Board of Health. You can determine how deep your septic system is, and then find out how deep the groundwater is. If the groundwater is within or less than 5 feet from the bottom of your leach field, then your septic system is not doing its job. Other ways, when septic systems are really bad, you can smell the contamination in nearby surface water bodies. You can see wet ground when your septic system is backed up. So those are kind of the nasty things that would tell you that you're having failed septic systems. Down on Cape Cod, they have a big issue with nutrients getting into their surface water bodies, and they know that's from septic systems. And those are not necessarily failed septic systems. They're just septic systems that are not doing their job as efficiently as they need to protect the surface water bodies down there. And they're trying to figure out what to do about that.
Thank you. Next question, this one might be more for you, Werner, if you have information, but are there any long-term plans for central sewer at Biddeford Pool? Which is...
that's a good question. I have not heard, I don't know what Biddeford's plans are regarding any sewer expansion for the pool area.
Okay. So those are the questions we have currently. I had
a question too.
Sure, go ahead.
And I couldn't type it in because I'm on the panel, I guess.
Yeah, that's fine. You ask it directly.
Yeah, so the fire station over here at Goose Rocks experienced salt water into their well, which was a big problem, of course, for their equipment. So I guess they had to dig a new, deeper well. That's probably a half mile from the coast. I'm just guessing. But my question is, is that indicative of what is likely to happen for other people in the neighborhood, or maybe the well? Does the depth of the well, is that a factor? Was it, just a shallow well as opposed to a deeper well?
Well, that's a good question. Was it a shallow well?
I do not know.
Okay. What I would expect is when you're at the coast and you're getting saltwater intrusion, the deeper well is worse than the shallow well.
Whoa.
The saltwater intrusion goes further inland the deeper you go. Now, that's assuming that the well is constructed properly. If you have a shallow well that's not constructed properly, and there might be some surface water, salt water coming down the side of the well or contaminating the well that way, you could also get saltwater intrusion. But that's a factor of how the well was constructed. But if you've got a shallow well near the coast and you have a deep well near the coast and they're both constructed properly, the deep well will hit salt water first.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
If they're both the same distance away from the coast.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Dan, I have a question here that came in via email.
Okay. Why don't you show it down, and then I have a couple here that have come in since.
Okay. Question coming in from a resident. It's and this is for you, Jane. What is the feasibility of modeling a new well for future saltwater intrusion? Is modeling cost prohibitive? What data is required for such modeling?
Okay, so if this is a public water supply well, I assume they're talking about a public water supply well as opposed to a domestic well. Modeling is quite expensive. Usually what happens when you do groundwater modeling, you'll do it for a community or you'll do it for a region, and it will be a project that's paid for, that has some money from the state for water supply issues. But the thing about groundwater modeling is it doesn't just answer one question, it answers many questions. And it can be used in the future to investigate things like siting different wells in different locations and looking at saltwater intrusion. So I guess what I'm saying is that the cost of groundwater modeling is expensive up front, but once you have a groundwater model for your community or for your regional area, you can use it to answer many questions. That being one of, where do we want to put our new public water supply well? How much can we pump before we pull in salt water? That kind of question.
So this is a follow-up. So if the community did this and then an individual is buying some land, would he be able to look at the town-wide and help him decide whether and how to develop that land, whether it's an appropriate place or a vulnerable place?
Yes, I mean, if the town has paid for groundwater modeling, that information and that information should be available to the public.
Jane, I have a sort of a related question, if it's all right if I jump in. When you start working with a community to develop a groundwater model, how do you determine the area that you model?
We always determine it based on the hydrology, the natural features. So we don't do it based on boundaries, political boundaries. We find the rivers are boundary conditions, so we find the nearest river that's outside of your area of interest. Another boundary condition would be the coast. Drainage divides are a natural boundary condition, so you would look at watersheds, and so you would try to model your area all within a particular watershed or more than one watershed, but you use those groundwater divides within a watershed to be your boundary condition. So typically, if we were interested in Kennebunkport, we would build a model that was much bigger than Kennebunkport, because we would want our model to be accurate for Kennebunkport. So we don't want our boundaries or the areas where the model might not be that accurate within the confines of Kennebunkport. That's our area of interest.
Okay. So kind of about the tie onto that, if we were to get together with some regional towns with Biddeford, Kennebunk, Wells, then we would do an area that's larger than all that. So all those towns would gain the benefit from the modeling.
That's right, and that
Okay.
that really makes the most sense, is to do something like that, especially if you have a water supply, district that's accessing those particular aquifers that's outside of your town, but it's really important to your town.
Yep. Okay. Great, thank you. Sort of a little bit of a different subject is, what is the cost, and this may be, again, maybe for Werner, what is the cost of connecting into the public septic system in Goose Rock's Beach currently?
So I'm going to say that depends if you've got access to sewer. So if you are, if you have frontage on town sewer, then, typically what you're going to pay, administratively, you're going to pay an impact fee to hook up to that, as well as, your annual bill. The actual cost of the construction cost of the connection, I think is going to depend on what your site constraints are and how far it is to your house to hook up. But that big piece right there, is, do you have frontage on town sewer? Is there a connection available? Impact fees, are usually, you can spend, I'm going to say, I think it's somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000 for that connection, fee. But that could be higher if you need to have, if you're on a pump system.
Was a sort of a follow-up is that they noted they were within 12 to 15 feet. Is there someone they should contact for that kind of?
Yeah, they should definitely talk to the sewer department, and they can give a more accurate, they can give you a more accurate estimate there. And what I'll do is I'll pull up that phone number and I'll put that in the answer here.
Okay, thank you. Then we have two other questions. They're sort of tied together. What is the depth of a shallow well, and what is the depth of a deep well? Just kind of to give a. You say something's a shallow well. I mean, that's a good question. What's shallow?
Yeah. So usually when I talk about a shallow well, I'll talk about a well that's in the sand and gravel aquifer or the overburden material. A deep well would be in bedrock, and deep wells can be, all over the place in terms of depth, because usually what a driller will do is just drill until they get the volume that they want. So what they're basically looking for is they're looking for a fracture zone. So in Durham, where we did our work, and in Newmarket, the deepest public water supply well, I think was, in Newmarket was 700 feet. In Durham, it was 1,000 feet. So those are deep wells. Those are really deep wells. Shallow wells that are in overburden, they're typically 100 feet or less.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions via email? Tom, did you notice?
Not by email, but you have another one in the Q&A. It's a follow-up to the Bruce Ruck's question.
Don't see it.
Ooh, it just disappeared.
No, I think that was the one that was, I mentioned there was 12 to 15 feet.
Yeah, I just answered that one.
Yeah, we just mentioned it.
All right.
Okay. All right. So one of the questions I had was the modeling you're using. Has there been any opportunities to test that against real life situations? I mean, I know we haven't had a lot of sea level change, but we've had some.
Yeah. No, we haven't been able to test it against sea level rise, really. Groundwater rise has been actually measured down on Cape Cod, so
Okay.
That's unrelated to the modeling. But they have a well down in Truro that they've been monitoring over a long period of time, meaning being the U.S. Geological Survey.
Yep.
And they've compared that to the sea level rise in Boston and found that the groundwater was rising at a similar rate.
Okay. That's interesting.
At that location.
Good. We do have another question. It gets back to the modeling. So what is the primary cost for modeling? Is it the data collection or is it the modeling software?
The modeling software, I already have. I use ModFlow, and that's provided by U.S. Geological Survey for free. So that's a groundwater modeling software that's been used all over the world. It's highly respected, highly utilized. And so, no, the cost is not in the modeling software, although there are other things that you buy to go along with that. The cost of the modeling is the time that it takes to do it. So it's really the labor cost. There's a fair amount of time and effort required to collect the data that's used to calibrate the model. So you compile all of this groundwater information from these wells that I had mentioned before about, drilling logs and so on. And you pull a lot of information off the GIS sites and you put it all together, and you have to come up with properties for the aquifer and that's used in the groundwater modeling part of it. The model itself is broken into little cells. So in Durham, each modeling grid cell was 200 feet by 200 feet. So it was a fairly large area, and the resolution is 200 feet by 200 feet. So there's a large amount of effort that goes into it.
When you've done some of this modeling, has there ever been a reason or desire that you'd want to have to drill a well to see what's subsurface, or not, to get to a really good answer or a critical answer in a critical situation?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when you construct a model, you use as much real data as you can get. You use the records of wells that have already been drilled. But if you have budget, and you can do a field study that goes right along with it as well. A field study that would look at, if you're looking at saltwater intrusion, you would put in wells and take samples of the groundwater and sample the salinity. And so, number one, you calibrate your model. Number two, you verify your model with different data.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question, Dan. What if you're putting in a new septic system for a new house near the coast? Would typically the engineer who designs that know the groundwater level? Does he have to test that before he can design the proper system? Or how do you know the system's really going to work given the ground level and the the rock formation along the coast, etc.?
Do you want to answer that, Werner? Or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take a stab at it. So when a septic system design is done, it starts off with a site evaluator, going out and doing test pits. And so they're digging test pits. Oftentimes they're out there, with a small piece of equipment, digging a test pit and looking for the depth, the limiting factor, that we talked about before. So that depth.
Oh, actually, we have somebody staying here, so.
Yeah. We might wait till Paul gets back.
Nobody's wrong.
Thanks.
Now, you guys gonna miss Zoom when don't do Zoom anymore?
We will miss Zoom.
Right. Yeah. So anyways, so they gather that data, they're primarily looking at the soil types there. And so there's within the design criteria, that the state puts forward, different soil types, get classified differently, and so, your best soils, are going to be, that nice kind of, sandy, gravelly soils. And then the more the more of a more clay content that you start to get into soils, that's going to be a lesser grade of soil. And based on the soils, so it's really very heavily, the design is heavily driven by soil types as well as what the design flow is going to be. And so with the soil types, there are tables that are used that the state has put out that will say, if you're on X type of soil, that gives you, some base parameters for how large the field may have to be. So the better the soils, the smaller the field, the more marginal the soils, the bigger the field. And so, that design criteria, along with the design flows, will determine what you have for the sizing of the field. Now, so that's one piece of it. Then there's elevations that are considered, in that criteria as well. And so oftentimes, those fields, are typically, I would say anywhere from, what we've seen is, at least 2 to 3 feet above whatever the limiting factor is. I could actually see it. Would it be helpful to show a design to folks?
I don't think that's necessary.
Okay. But so there's a fair amount of work that goes into the development of a system. And again, a lot of it, relies heavily on the types of soils that you're working in.
Just a question on good soil, bad soil. When you see a soil that says excessively drained, does that mean good or bad?
Excessively drained?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I guess, I'm not the site evaluator making the judgment call on what is, what is excessively drained soil.
So that begs the good question. So when someone comes in with a fancy report, does the town's, if you're not the person who, can evaluate that, does the town hire an engineer to validate that, then say, yep, you got it right, that's what's necessary? Or do you just rely on, the applicant's engineer for that?
Yeah, so when we get a septic system design, that comes in, if we need to validate it, we'll validate it based on the design criteria that's in the subsurface waste code. And then we go from there. If, in the case of a bigger system, say for instance, for a conditional use application, then we always have the option to get a peer review or to have the state look at it. But that's not typical for single family home designs, or anything that's under a certain size is done at the local level.
Thank you.
Okay, and there was one follow-up question, but I do think you answered it, Jane, during the discussion on modeling. It came in after you talked, was how much data, I guess, the data you're collecting for modeling, how much of that comes from the existing wells?
A lot of data comes from existing wells. Yeah, we really dig in and try and find as much existing information as we can. And there's a lot of it out there. And LiDAR has really helped, because a lot of the old records, the records from wells, the wells haven't been surveyed. And so you have a depth to water from the ground surface. And now with LiDAR, we can use those wells where we couldn't before.
Okay. Well, that's it for questions, and I really appreciate everyone asking those, and Jane and Werner for answering them. If anyone is watching this video later and happens to have a question, please send that question to the GPC at kennebunkportcp.info. which is shown on the screen and hopefully will be shown again during the video. The next section is, where are we? Losing my time here. So it's a connection to the comprehensive plan. So Tom and Liz, at this point, I think you're going to take over and sort of lead us through some tie-ins to our comp plan.
Yes, I can speak to that. Liz had to just leave momentarily, but
Okay.
But I can start in on that.
Very good.
Yeah, and this last series of questions that Paul posed about septic systems, you know, I was thinking, as you're saying, it's something that Jane mentioned early on in her presentation, is everybody's assuming the groundwater is going to stay more or less the way it is. But what we've heard tonight is it's not. And, you know, we got to think of the implications for future residential development in town, you know, if they're outside the sewer district. You know, there could be a couple implications that come to mind immediately for me, and that is one, there's some areas of town that may be buildable today that won't be in the future, absent, you know, an extension of the municipal sewer system. Liz, I see you're back. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm sorry, I had to step away for a second. Could you repeat the question?
A few minutes ago, we were talking about the design of septic systems, and these people who design them they're looking very carefully for where the water table is, but there's always been an assumption that the water table will change seasonally, but it's not going to change over time significantly. But what we've heard this evening is that's not the case. In some parts of town, the water table will change. It's going to rise. So what are the implications for the comprehensive plan? We could, you know, the growth planning committees really kind of have to anticipate those parts of town that you're used to assume, yeah, you could put septic systems there. Well, maybe not. And if you can't, as Jane said, you know, some of these changes that are coming, you got to plan for them. And you know, one way you could plan for that situation is if you see a part of town that is not going to be suitable for septic systems in the future, then you got to start thinking about, well, how can this be served by the municipal system? Or, you know, other alternatives, maybe some parts of town just are going to be very difficult to develop. And that's important information to have in the plan as well, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that, what we can learn from the modeling and as well as sort of some of the existing conditions with respect to where wetlands are located can also help. It's typical for communities to regulate development and the location of septic systems based on proximity to things like wetlands. So looking at how sufficient the buffers are from wetlands can help guide suitable septic system installation locations as well, I think.
And I also noted early on that Jane addressed infrastructure, because, you know, periodically the town's going to have to renovate or upgrade both the sewer system and the road network. And you know, everybody's been cognizant of the threat of sea level rise coming from the immediate coast, but we know now that, you know, the water is going to be coming from two directions, and it's important to keep that in mind when you are planning major investments in roadways that need to be renovated, and the same with your sewer systems.
Right. Yeah, the graphic with the seawall and building the seawall up to protect you from the sea level rise was a good one to show, because the water just comes in underneath, so, impacting our groundwater.
Yeah. So just when you thought you had a solution, whoops.
Yeah. Look for another one. Okay. Any comments from the GPC members?
You know, I've been in real estate a long time, and what we're seeing is not as often as you would think, but newer designs of septic systems, especially closer to the coast, where they have to perform a certain way in order to be legal. Does Werner, have you had any experience with any of those type of systems?
So, one thing that we've seen, is that we've seen some interesting systems that have come about, as the state was moving away from the overboard discharge systems. For those of you who aren't familiar, an overboard discharge, was a system that was, I want to say it was probably in the 70s and the 80s is when overboard discharges were more of a thing. And so those were properties where you couldn't meet the criteria, and you had a septic tank and you had a sand filter, but it required a fair amount of treatment on behalf of the property owner. Had to keep up and maintain these overboard discharges. And then instead of discharging, once the wastewater was treated, you had a pipe that would discharge to the water body then. And so from what I understand, those systems operated as long as they were maintained, but when property owners didn't maintain them, then you had issues. You had contamination. You had coastal water contamination when they weren't maintained. So then for quite some time, the state then created regulations surrounding the relicensing of OBDs, and so you had to have a site evaluator would go out and check these systems every so many years, and it was quite a process. So and one of the things that had to be signed off on was there had to be no other alternative. In order to get your OBD relicensed, there had to be no other alternative to that. Well, so as the technology got better, alternatives all of a sudden became available. And so, what we've seen is we have seen a number of systems, and I can tell you they're horrendously expensive, but that are essentially, for all practical purposes, mini treatment systems that, the end resulting water that comes out of the system whenever it's done has been treated to a drinking water standard. And so as a result, then that water, instead of having to go into a leach field, as a treatment field, goes into a field essentially just as a disbursement field. It's not a field that's intended for treatment. But they're again horrifically expensive. I mean, I've heard of upwards $40,000 to $50,000 for that type of a system, and usually the state also would require a long-term maintenance contract to go along with those as well, to make sure that they were actually maintained by the company that either did the installation or had a long-term service contract. I think they tried to, they learned from the mistake of just letting the property owner maintain those types of systems. But
Yeah, thanks.
Any other comments from the group?
I have a quick question. Jane, how did Durham decide to use an 8-foot sea level rise scenario for their model?
Yeah, they decided they wanted to go beyond 2100. Yep. They came to the conclusion that all life doesn't end at 2100.
Let's hope not.
Especially for the young ones.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's not, Jane, in Maine, I don't know if you're aware, the Maine Climate Council came out with some recommendations in December, and they're aiming for a 3.9 foot sea level rise at the end of the century. But they say if you're looking at critical infrastructure, such as a sewer system, they said you should plan for 8.8 feet, which is Yeah, well, that's kind of more bold than what we've seen, further south.
Right. Right.
I see we do have one comment that came in. It says, when I was a lobsterman in the early 70s, some of the best areas to set the traps and catch lobsters was in the front houses on the coast that had overflow systems drained directly in the ocean. That was...
Yep.
Yeah, and my guess is that those were not actual overboard discharge systems. I suspect those were the straight pipes.
Yep, fully loaded.
Yep.
All right. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Knott, for sharing your knowledge and experience on the groundwater rising, which I didn't think I'd be talking about at some point. Always just thinking about sea level rise. So really appreciate that information.
Well, my pleasure. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out anytime.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the next things I want to talk about is sort of mentioning, we've, of course, with COVID hitting, it really put a damper on some of the plans we had in place, and we had to delay them. But it looks like now that we're going to be able to hold a public session in July called a SWAT session. We're still working out the details, the specific details of where it'll be held, but hopefully it'll be outside under a tent on a beautiful evening in the end of July. And there's information on what a SWAT session is. If you haven't seen one or participated in one before, it's analyzing the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats to different subjects that will be important to Kennebunkport in our planning process. So I'd ask you to pay attention to the website, to look for more information as it becomes, as we firm up the plan. And hopefully you'll be able to participate live and join us, and we can get what's so valuable and so important to this whole process is the feedback from the town. And I'd like to especially acknowledge and thank those who watched this evening and asked questions. I really appreciate their questions and comments. It's important for the GPC to understand your thoughts and what your expectations are for our town as we move forward. Also, to sort of kind of close that gap where we haven't been able to meet one-on-one, we have been doing our mini surveys, and we've gotten really good feedback from those, good participation. And I would ask you, if you haven't had a chance to do one or all of them, that they're still alive, you can still get into them, and you can take those surveys and give us your feedback. So I think that covers those topics. And that really covers our agenda for this evening. Next time we meet, we'll go back to doing our regular schedule. And I would ask you all that if you can join us via Zoom, please do so. Hoping at some point in the near future, we'll be able to do some of these live and get more participation face-to-face. But we'll see how all that pans out. In our next meeting, what do we have for the agenda for the next meeting? We have a draft of a chapter to review, or we're going to be working focusing on the July workshop?
Yeah, we'll be preparing for this one.
Okay, very good. Yep. Okay, I see that here. Thank you. Yeah, so we're preparing for the SWAT, and we'll have the approval of our minutes. And I don't think we have anything from the town, do we, Werner? Do we have to follow up on?
No, not at this
No, you
point.
weren't, sir. Okay, good. Okay, any other comments from Tom, Liz, or GPC members? Okay, there are none. Mr. Fitzgerald, I'll turn the meeting over to you.
I move that this meeting be adjourned.
Mr. Higginson.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, again, thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.